The easiest lie to believe is the one told under oath. The courtroom was so quiet that even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than the people gathered beneath them. 12 jurors sat motionless, their attention fixed on the witness stand where Officer Ethan Brooks adjusted his dark blue uniform with calm confidence. His silver badge reflected the cold fluorescent light as if it carried the weight of unquestionable truth. Across the room, cameras from local news stations remained perfectly still, waiting for the testimony that everyone believed would end the case before lunch. At the defense table sat a black woman in handcuffs named Avery Jackson. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't plead for sympathy. She simply watched the room with remarkable patience, her expression unreadable beneath the pressure surrounding her. To everyone else she looked like another defendant whose fate had already been decided. The whispered conversations behind the gallery benches painted their own story before a single word had been spoken. Some believed she had crossed the wrong officer. Others assumed she must have done something serious to deserve standing before a judge in restraints. Nobody questioned why she appeared so composed. Nobody wondered why fear never reached her eyes. Judge Harold Whitmore entered the courtroom, bringing every conversation to an abrupt stop. The bailiff announced the session, and everyone rose before settling back into their seats. The atmosphere carried the familiar weight of procedure, routine, and expectation. Every movement followed a script that had played out thousands of times before. Then Officer Brooks stood, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. His voice was steady, practiced, almost reassuring. If someone had walked into the courtroom at that exact moment, they would have believed they were listening to an honest public servant fulfilling his duty. Brooks began describing the arrest with remarkable confidence. According to his testimony, Avery had interfered with an active police investigation, refused repeated lawful instructions, and attempted to conceal critical evidence. Each sentence sounded polished, every detail carefully arranged like pieces of a puzzle designed to leave only one conclusion. Members of the jury nodded slightly while reporters scribbled across their notebooks. Even the prosecutor appeared satisfied that the case was unfolding exactly as expected. Avery remained silent. She neither interrupted nor objected. She simply listened, folding her cuffed hands neatly together on the table as though she had heard every word before. The silence around her slowly became more noticeable than Brooks' testimony itself. It wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence of someone waiting for time to reveal what people refused to see. From the back row, a man wearing a plain grey suit quietly entered the courtroom without attracting attention. He carried no briefcase, wore no visible credentials, and greeted no one. He simply took an empty seat and observed every face in the room. Brooks never looked toward him. Neither did the judge. Their attention remained fixed on the woman whose future appeared to be slipping away with every carefully spoken sentence. But somewhere beneath the polished rhythm of sworn testimony, invisible cracks had already begun spreading through the foundation of the entire case. The courtroom believed it was witnessing the final chapter of Avery Jackson's story. In reality, it had just become the opening scene of Officer Ethan Brooks' downfall, though not a single person inside that room knew it yet. A slow breath escaped the courtroom as Officer Ethan Brooks stepped down from the witness stand with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed every word had landed exactly where he intended. He straightened his jacket, offered a respectful nod toward the prosecutor, and returned to his seat without once looking at Avery Jackson. Confidence followed him like a shadow. He had testified in court many times before, and every appearance had strengthened his reputation as a dependable officer whose reports were rarely questioned. Around him, the courtroom settled into a familiar rhythm. Pen scratched across legal pads. The court reporter continued recording every sentence with mechanical precision. Members of the jury exchanged thoughtful glances while quietly organizing the story they had just heard inside their minds. To them, the picture seemed almost complete. An experienced police officer had presented a detailed account. A woman in handcuffs had remained silent. The balance appeared obvious. Yet silence can often carry more weight than the loudest accusation. Avery sat perfectly still, her posture unchanged despite the growing pressure surrounding her. She did not react to the subtle looks from the gallery or the quiet whispers floating through the rows behind her. She seemed more interested in observing the people inside the room than defending herself against the story being built around her. Her eyes moved carefully from the judge to the prosecutor, then briefly toward the jury before resting on the large American flag standing beside the bench. It was almost as though she were measuring something invisible, waiting for a clock that only she could see. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses and reviewed several pages resting before him. The evidence presented so far appeared orderly, supported by official reports and sworn testimony. Even so, an uneasy feeling lingered beneath the polished surface of the proceedings. It was impossible to identify, yet difficult to ignore. Something about the case felt unusually controlled, as though every piece had been arranged too perfectly. The prosecutor called attention to the arrest report, highlighting details that seemed to reinforce Brooks' testimony. Dates aligned. Statements matched. Timelines appeared consistent. Every document strengthened the appearance of certainty. Across the room, several spectators quietly nodded as if the outcome had become inevitable. Then the judge noticed something unexpected. Avery had not looked at a single exhibit introduced against her. Most defendants watched every document with anxiety or frustration, searching for opportunities to challenge what they believed was unfair. Avery did neither. Instead, she calmly watched Officer Brooks. Not with anger. Not with fear. Simply with steady patience. The same man in the plain grey suit remained seated near the back of the courtroom. He never interrupted the proceedings, yet his attention never drifted. Occasionally he wrote short notes inside a small black notebook before closing it again. No one asked who he was. No one seemed interested enough to notice him for more than a passing moment. Brooks certainly did not. He leaned toward another officer and quietly exchanged what appeared to be a relaxed conversation, even allowing himself the faintest smile. He believed the difficult part was already over. The testimony had been delivered. The courtroom had listened. The record had been established. Outside the tall windows, dark clouds slowly gathered above the courthouse, dimming the afternoon light until long shadows stretched across the polished wooden floor. Inside, the room remained calm, almost ordinary. Yet beneath that calm surface, unseen pieces were already shifting into place. The story everyone believed they understood was quietly preparing to become something entirely different, and the first person who would realize it would not be Avery Jackson. It would be Officer Ethan Brooks himself. The prosecutor rose with quiet confidence, smoothing the front of his suit before taking several measured steps toward the center of the courtroom. Every movement reflected certainty. He thanked Officer Ethan Brooks for his testimony and began carefully reinforcing each point with documents that appeared official, complete, and beyond question. A photograph flashed across the courtroom monitor. Then another. A timeline followed, each event arranged with impressive precision. Every exhibit seemed to strengthen the same conclusion, and with every passing minute the weight pressing against Avery Jackson appeared to grow heavier. Members of the jury leaned forward with increasing attention. Some highlighted notes they had written only moments earlier. Others compared the testimony to the documents displayed on the screen, finding no obvious contradiction. The quiet confidence that had settled over the courtroom began transforming into silent agreement. Behind the gallery rail, spectators exchanged knowing glances, convinced they were witnessing another routine case moving steadily toward an unavoidable verdict. Officer Brooks noticed the growing momentum and allowed himself another restrained smile. Years of experience had taught him that once a courtroom accepted the first version of a story, changing that story became almost impossible. He folded his hands comfortably and watched as each carefully prepared report seemed to reinforce his credibility. Every sentence he had spoken under oath now appeared supported by official paperwork carrying signatures, dates, and department seals. To anyone watching, the evidence looked complete. Avery continued saying nothing. Her cuffed hands rested quietly on the table while her attention remained fixed on the people around her instead of the documents appearing across the large monitor. She watched the prosecutor's confidence. She watched the jurors' expressions. She watched Officer Brooks with remarkable patience. There was no frustration in her face, no visible disappointment, and no sign that the courtroom's opinion of her had changed anything inside her. That unusual calm slowly became difficult to ignore. Judge Harold Whitmore noticed it again. Most defendants under such pressure searched desperately for reassurance from their attorneys or reacted emotionally as testimony accumulated against them. Avery did neither. She almost appeared to be listening for something beyond the spoken words, as though another conversation was unfolding beneath the one everyone else could hear. The judge lowered his pen for a brief moment, studying her expression before returning his attention to the proceedings. Near the rear of the courtroom, the man in the plain grey suit quietly checked the time on his watch before slipping it beneath his sleeve again. His notebook remained closed now. Instead, he observed Officer Brooks with calm concentration, never interrupting, never speaking, never attracting attention. Another unfamiliar woman entered through the courtroom doors carrying a slim leather portfolio. She quietly took a seat several rows away without exchanging greetings with anyone. Brooks barely noticed her arrival. His confidence had become so complete that the room itself felt predictable. Everything appeared to be moving exactly according to plan. Then the prosecutor requested permission to introduce one final supporting report into evidence. As the clerk accepted the document, a brief hesitation crossed her face. She looked at the first page, then at the attached certification, before quietly glancing toward the judge. It lasted only a second, but Avery noticed it immediately. So did the man in the grey suit. Brooks did not. He remained focused on the jury, convinced that every passing moment carried him farther from accountability. He had no idea that the smallest hesitation inside an ordinary courtroom often becomes the first thread that begins unraveling an entire fabric of carefully constructed lies. The clerk cleared her throat almost imperceptibly before placing the final report on the judge's bench. It should have been an ordinary moment, another document joining dozens of others already admitted into the record, yet something about her hesitation quietly changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Judge Harold Whitmore lowered his reading glasses and examined the certification page more carefully than before. The room remained silent except for the gentle turning of paper and the distant rumble of thunder beyond the courthouse windows. Officer Ethan Brooks noticed the pause but dismissed it without concern. Administrative delays happened every day, and nothing about his confidence suggested he believed this one would be any different. The prosecutor stepped forward, offering a reassuring explanation that the paperwork had simply arrived from the Records Division earlier that morning. The judge accepted the explanation with a polite nod, although his eyes lingered on the page a few seconds longer than expected. Across the room, Avery Jackson finally shifted for the first time since the hearing began. It was not a dramatic movement. She simply raised her eyes toward the courtroom clock mounted high on the wall. The second hand continued its steady rhythm. Tick after tick. Almost as though she had been waiting for that exact minute to arrive. Her attorney quietly leaned toward her and whispered something that no one else could hear. Avery responded with only a slight nod before returning her attention to the witness area. There was still no panic in her expression. No urgency. Only remarkable patience. Behind the spectators, the man in the plain grey suit slowly stood and walked toward the back doors before stopping beside the woman carrying the slim leather portfolio. They exchanged no greeting and spoke only a few words too quietly for anyone nearby to understand. She opened the portfolio just enough for him to review a single page before closing it again. Moments later, both calmly returned to separate seats as though nothing unusual had happened. Brooks never looked in their direction. Instead, he focused on the jurors, confident that each passing minute strengthened his position. Years of experience had convinced him that appearances mattered as much as facts inside a courtroom. He looked composed. His reports appeared complete. His testimony had been delivered without hesitation. Everything remained under control, or so he believed. Then an unexpected request interrupted the rhythm of the hearing. The courtroom clerk quietly informed the judge that a secure communication had arrived for immediate review. A courtroom deputy approached with a sealed envelope bearing a federal identification label. The judge accepted it without comment, carefully examining the exterior before placing it unopened beside the stack of evidence. Several people noticed the unusual delivery. Reporters exchanged puzzled looks. The prosecutor briefly tightened his jaw before recovering his professional composure. Brooks glanced toward the envelope for only a moment before looking away again, apparently unconcerned. Avery noticed every reaction in the room. Her breathing remained steady. Her eyes never left the judge. Outside, rain finally began tapping softly against the courthouse windows, covering the building in a gray curtain that blurred the city beyond the glass. Inside, every person remained seated, unaware that the hearing had quietly crossed an invisible line. What had begun as a straightforward prosecution was slowly becoming something far more complicated. Tiny details that seemed meaningless on their own were beginning to connect beneath the surface, forming a pattern that only a handful of people inside the courtroom could recognize. Everyone else still believed they were watching the end of one woman's case. They did not realize they were slowly walking toward the beginning of a much larger truth. Judge Harold Whitmore rested his hand on the sealed federal envelope for several quiet seconds before finally breaking the seal with deliberate care. The sound of paper unfolding echoed through the silent courtroom, drawing every pair of eyes toward the bench. No one spoke. Even the reporters lowered their pens, sensing that something unexpected had entered a hearing that had seemed completely predictable only minutes earlier. The judge scanned the first page, then paused. His expression did not reveal surprise, but the calm certainty that had guided the proceedings since the morning began slowly gave way to careful curiosity. He read the document a second time before looking toward the courtroom clerk. Without raising his voice, he asked her to verify the authenticity of the attached federal authorization number. The clerk nodded immediately and quietly stepped away. Officer Ethan Brooks shifted slightly in his chair for the first time that day. It was almost invisible, just enough movement to suggest a passing moment of uncertainty before he quickly recovered his composed posture. He reminded himself that federal agencies often exchanged paperwork with state courts. There was no reason to believe this involved him. He folded his hands together once more and fixed his attention on the judge, determined not to reveal even the smallest trace of concern. Avery Jackson remained exactly as she had been since the hearing began. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing never changed. She looked neither hopeful nor anxious. Instead, she watched the courtroom with the quiet patience of someone who understood that truth often arrived one careful step at a time. Her attorney leaned closer again, but this time Avery answered with only the faintest smile before returning her eyes to the bench. It was the first hint of emotion anyone had seen from her all day, and it disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. At the back of the courtroom, the man in the plain gray suit stood once more. He quietly approached the courtroom deputy and handed over a small identification wallet without saying a word. The deputy examined it carefully, his professional expression changing almost immediately. Instead of asking questions, he gave a respectful nod and walked directly toward the judge. They exchanged only a few whispered sentences before the deputy returned the identification with visible respect. Several members of the gallery noticed the exchange. Whispered conversations briefly rippled through the benches before the bailiff restored silence. The prosecutor watched the interaction carefully. His confidence had begun to fade, replaced by the cautious awareness that events were moving beyond the script he had prepared. He glanced toward Officer Brooks, expecting reassurance, but Brooks remained focused on the judge, unaware that the steady foundation beneath his testimony had already begun to shift. Outside, the rain intensified, covering the courthouse windows with silver streaks that softened the afternoon light. Inside, the atmosphere had changed completely. The room no longer felt like a courtroom approaching the end of an ordinary case. It felt like a place waiting for an answer that had been hidden in plain sight from the very beginning. Then the courtroom clerk returned carrying a printed confirmation. She handed it directly to Judge Whitmore, who read the brief statement in silence before slowly lifting his eyes toward Avery Jackson. For the first time that day, he did not see a defendant sitting before him. He saw someone connected to a story that was far larger than anyone in the courtroom had imagined, and although no revelation had yet been spoken aloud, the balance of power had already begun to change. Judge Harold Whitmore carefully folded the confirmation letter and placed it beside the sealed envelope before looking across the courtroom with an expression that no longer reflected routine confidence. The room had become so quiet that every small movement seemed amplified. A chair shifted softly in the gallery. Someone cleared a throat near the Back row. Even the steady tapping of rain against the courthouse windows sounded louder than before. The judge spoke slowly, choosing every word with unusual precision. He announced that new information had been verified through official federal channels and that the court would briefly suspend the current line of testimony before proceeding further. Confused whispers immediately spread across the spectators, only to disappear as the bailiff reminded everyone to remain silent. Officer Ethan Brooks felt the first unmistakable weight of uncertainty settle across his thoughts. Until now, every development had seemed manageable, every delay explainable. But federal verification was different. He glanced toward the prosecutor, expecting a reassuring expression. Instead, he found someone studying the judge with visible concern. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Brooks realized that events were moving beyond anyone's preparation. The man in the plain gray suit quietly stood once again. This time there was no hesitation in his steps. He walked directly toward the front of the courtroom, accompanied by the woman carrying the leather portfolio. Both stopped several feet from the bench before presenting official identification. Judge Whitmore reviewed the credentials carefully, then gave a respectful nod that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. Several courtroom deputies instinctively straightened their posture. The prosecutor took one slow step backward without realizing it. Reporters exchanged bewildered glances, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Avery Jackson remained seated exactly where she had been all afternoon. She did not ask to speak. She did not celebrate the sudden change in momentum. She simply waited with the same calm composure that had puzzled everyone since the hearing began. Then the judge looked directly at her and spoke in a voice that carried through every corner of the courtroom. He asked whether she wished to address the court in light of the newly confirmed federal documentation. Avery slowly rose to her feet. The courtroom watched in complete silence. She turned first toward the judge, then toward the jury, before speaking with quiet professionalism. She identified herself as Special Agent Avery Jackson, assigned to a Federal Bureau of Investigation task force conducting a long-term public corruption investigation authorized under sealed federal supervision. No dramatic gesture followed. No raised voice. No display of triumph. She simply stated the facts with the confidence of someone fulfilling an official responsibility. The word settled over the courtroom like a sudden change in weather. Officer Brooks stared at her without speaking. His confident expression faded into disbelief as he searched her face for any sign that this might somehow be a misunderstanding. There was none. The man in the gray suit calmly opened the leather portfolio and handed several sealed documents to the courtroom deputy, who immediately delivered them to the bench. Judge Whitmore reviewed the first page, then quietly instructed the bailiff to remove Avery's handcuffs without delay. The metallic click echoed softly through the silent courtroom as the restraints were unlocked. Avery gently rubbed one wrist before placing both hands at her sides. She stood with quiet dignity, neither accusing nor celebrating anyone. In that single moment, without anger, without confrontation, and without raising her voice, the woman everyone believed was standing trial was revealed to be the very person entrusted with uncovering the truth, while the certainty that had protected Officer Ethan Brooks only minutes earlier began to disappear before the eyes of everyone in the room. The silence that followed Avery Jackson's introduction seemed to stretch far beyond the walls of the courtroom. No one rushed to speak. No one moved. The only sound was the steady rain falling against the tall courthouse windows, as though even the weather had paused to witness the moment. Judge Harold Whitmore carefully reviewed the federal documents one page at a time, comparing each authorization with the case file already before him. Every signature matched. Every reference number aligned. Every seal confirmed what only a handful of people had known until now. The investigation had never been about proving Avery guilty. It had been about determining whether the justice system itself had been manipulated from within. Officer Ethan Brooks remained frozen in his chair. Only minutes earlier he had carried himself with the confidence of a respected officer whose testimony would shape the outcome of the hearing. Now that confidence slowly gave way to uncertainty as he watched document after document reach the judge's bench. The prosecutor quietly requested permission to examine the federal records. Judge Whitmore granted the request without hesitation. As the prosecutor read through the first pages, the certainty in his expression disappeared. He looked toward Brooks, then back at the documents, realizing that several reports presented earlier that day were now being measured against evidence gathered through an independent federal investigation. Avery stood calmly beside the defense table, her hands now free, maintaining the same quiet professionalism she had displayed from the beginning. She did not interrupt the proceedings or accuse anyone. When the judge invited clarification regarding the scope of the investigation, she answered with measured precision. She explained that the task force had spent months reviewing official reports, body camera records, dispatch logs, digital timestamps, and sworn statements connected to multiple incidents. The purpose had never been to target individuals without evidence. The purpose had been to verify whether public trust had been compromised through repeated inconsistencies that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom monitor, which earlier displayed reports supporting Brooks' testimony, now presented certified records supplied under federal authorization. One timeline appeared beside another. Entry times differed. Radio logs revealed gaps that required explanation. Official records created by separate agencies no longer aligned with portions of the testimony already given under oath. None of the information relied on speculation. Each document simply asked the same quiet question. If every report described the same event, why did the details no longer agree? Members of the jury watched closely as the foundation beneath the original narrative slowly weakened. Reporters who had expected an ordinary hearing now filled page after page with hurried notes, recognizing that the story unfolding before them had become far larger than anyone anticipated. Even the spectators who had silently judged Avery earlier now looked toward her with entirely different expressions, realizing how easily appearances had shaped their assumptions. Judge Whitmore closed one folder and opened another before speaking in a calm but unmistakably serious tone. He stated that the court could not ignore verified federal evidence and that every conflicting statement would receive careful legal review before any further determination could be made. Those words changed everything. The courtroom was no longer focused on defending a single version of events. It was focused on discovering the truth. Officer Brooks lowered his eyes for the first time that day, while Avery remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, steady, composed, and committed to allowing verified facts rather than emotion to speak on behalf of justice. Judge Harold Whitmore allowed several moments of silence before speaking again, giving every person in the courtroom time to absorb what had just unfolded. The hearing no longer resembled the straightforward proceeding that had begun earlier that morning. It had become a careful examination of accountability itself. Every document now carried greater significance because each one was measured against independently verified federal records rather than assumption or appearance. The prosecutor slowly closed the folder resting in his hands and addressed the court with noticeably different language than before. Instead of defending the original narrative, he acknowledged that substantial questions now existed regarding the accuracy of critical testimony and supporting documentation. The shift was impossible to miss. Only an hour earlier, certainty had filled the room. Now every conclusion required verification. Officer Ethan Brooks remained seated, his confident posture replaced by visible restraint. He looked toward the witness stand where he had spoken under oath, then toward the evidence monitor displaying the carefully organized timelines. The records presented by the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not rely on opinions. Dispatch logs, electronic access records, official communications, and preserved digital timestamps formed a sequence that neither emotion nor reputation could easily overcome. One discrepancy might have been explained as an oversight. Several independent discrepancies pointing in the same direction demanded a different level of scrutiny. Judge Whitmore carefully summarized the court's responsibility. He reminded everyone present that justice depended not upon titles, uniforms, or assumptions, but upon truthful evidence examined through lawful process. Those words settled over the courtroom with remarkable weight. They were not directed at one individual. They served as a reminder that every participant in the legal system carried the same obligation to protect public trust. Avery Jackson listened quietly without interruption. Her expression remained calm, showing neither satisfaction nor resentment. She had not entered the courtroom seeking applause or personal vindication. She had entered carrying the responsibility of an investigation whose purpose extended beyond a single hearing. When asked whether additional federal materials existed, she confirmed that certified records had been preserved under proper legal authority and would be provided through established judicial procedures. There was no dramatic announcement, only professional certainty supported by documented facts. Reporters continued writing rapidly, aware that the story developing before them had changed from a local court proceeding into a broader conversation about integrity within public institutions. Members of the gallery who had earlier whispered quiet judgments now sat in thoughtful silence. Some looked toward Avery with respect. Others looked toward the judge, recognizing that the legal process itself was demonstrating why patience mattered when the full truth had not yet been revealed. Judge Whitmore then issued a series of procedural orders directing that the disputed testimony, supporting reports, and related evidence receive immediate independent review before any further action in the matter could continue. The courtroom deputy acknowledged each instruction while the clerk carefully entered every directive into the official record. The atmosphere had completely transformed. Confidence built upon assumption had given way to confidence built upon verification. As the hearing paused, Avery gathered nothing from the defense table except her composure. She stood quietly, watching the courtroom around her with the same steady dignity she had carried from the very beginning. Without raising her voice or seeking recognition, she had allowed the facts to reshape the room, proving that genuine justice often arrives not through the loudest accusation, but through the quiet persistence of truth patiently waiting for its rightful moment. When the court recessed, no one hurried toward the exit. The room remained suspended in thoughtful silence, as though every person present understood they had witnessed more than an unexpected legal development. They had watched assumption surrender to evidence. Judge Harold Whitmore remained on the bench for several additional moments before addressing everyone one final time. He reminded the courtroom that the integrity of the justice system depended upon the courage to question every claim, regardless of who presented it or how convincing it first appeared. Public confidence, he explained, could never rest on reputation alone. It had to be earned through honesty, transparency, and accountability. Those words lingered in the air long after he stepped away. Avery Jackson quietly gathered the single notebook that had remained beside her throughout the hearing. She thanked her attorney with a respectful nod before exchanging a brief handshake with the federal officials who had entered the courtroom earlier that afternoon. There was no celebration waiting outside the courtroom doors. No dramatic speech. No victory pose for the cameras. She understood that the purpose of the investigation had never been personal recognition. Its purpose had always been protecting the public's faith that the law could still correct itself when guided by truth. Officer Ethan Brooks remained seated as the courtroom slowly emptied around him. The certainty that had accompanied him onto the witness stand had disappeared, replaced by the unmistakable reality that every statement, every report, and every decision connected to the investigation would now receive careful independent review through established legal procedures. The badge resting on his uniform had not changed, yet its meaning suddenly felt different. It no longer represented unquestioned authority. It represented a responsibility that demanded honesty above all else. Reporters quietly filed out, already preparing stories that would reach thousands of readers before sunrise. Yet the headline many expected that morning had completely changed. What began as an ordinary court proceeding had become a powerful reminder that appearances can never replace verified facts. Members of the jury left with expressions far different from the ones they carried into the courtroom. They had been reminded that patience is one of justice's greatest strengths because the full truth does not always arrive with the opening statement. Sometimes it arrives only after every document has been examined, every assumption has been challenged, and every voice has finally been heard. Outside, the rain had stopped. Late afternoon sunlight slowly pushed through the retreating clouds, casting warm reflections across the courthouse steps as people quietly returned to their daily lives. Avery paused for only a brief moment before walking toward the waiting federal vehicle. She never looked back at the courtroom behind her because her work had never been about one building or one hearing. It had always been about preserving the principles the building was meant to protect. As the courthouse doors slowly closed, the lesson left behind was impossible to ignore. A uniform may command attention. A title may inspire respect. A sworn oath may sound convincing. But none of those things can stand forever against carefully verified truth. In the end, justice was never rescued by the loudest voice in the room. It was restored by quiet integrity, unwavering patience, and the courage to let facts speak when emotions could not. Because the strongest foundation any courtroom can ever have is not power, not fear, and not appearances. It is the simple decision to tell the truth, even when the truth changes everything.